Hello again, poetry lovers. It is now December, which is often dark and dour, but then we are on the threshold of Christmas, and so many of us may think it is a time for joy. Joy? What's that? Some might say. Well, a dictionary definition is the emotion evoked by well-being or good fortune. Or you could call it a state of felicity, however brief. Or try joy as a source of or cause of delight. But I think poetry is the place to go for a more detailed look at this state. Most people think of poetry as being mainly a source of sad stories, but not really. It depends on the poet and the poem and the mood of the time. I will be reading a selection of poems from Christian Wyman's book, Joy, 100 Poems. And let's see here. This is what it looks like, the cover of it. Some of you may have seen this book or even owned it, but it is quite an interesting book. 100 poems with the underpinning of joy, or the overriding theme of joy, although it's not always exactly obvious when you read the poem that it's specifically about joy. But let's start with one by Norman MacCaig, a Scottish poet. And this poem is entitled One of Many Days. I never saw more frogs than once at the back of Ben Doran. Joseph coated, they ambled and jumped in the sweet marsh grass like colored ideas. The river ran glass in the sun. I waded in the jocular water of Loch Lyon. A parcel of hinds gave the V sign with their ears, then ran off and off till they were cantering. Crumbs. I watched a whole long day release its miracles. But clearest of all, I remember the Joseph-coated frogs. Amiably ambling or jumping into the air like colored ideas, tinily considering the huge concept of Ben Doran. Well, just to bring you up to date in case you didn't catch it, but a parcel of hinds means a little herd of deer. Hinds is the another word for, specifically in Scotland, a red deer. Usually a female deer is called a hind. And the whole day was a miracle for the poet, as he says, I watched the whole day long release its miracles. And so that's the opening poem for our study of joy under the leadership of Christian Wyman. And Christian Wyman has another book out. It's primarily a prose book, but it talks about how he became and still is a very strong Christian believer, and it had to do with his treatment for fatal or potentially fatal blood disorder for which he was successfully treated quite a few years ago now. And so he has kind of a Christian outlook on life, and Christians, believe it or not, are joyful people. And so, in a way, he's picking these poems not because of their religious content, but because of their joy content. Now let me find another poem here that I want to read, if I can find it. Here it is, I think. Yes, this poem is called First Song, and it's by a well-known poet, actually. His name is Galway Kinnell. Galway Kinnell. I think he's Irish. First Song. Then it was dusk in Illinois. The small boy, after an afternoon of carting dung, hung on the rail fence, a sapped thing, weary to crying. Dark was growing tall, and he began to hear the pond frogs all calling on his ear with what seemed their joy. Soon their sound was pleasant for a boy listening in the smoky dusk and the nightfall of Illinois, and from the fields 2 small boys came, bearing cornstalk violins, and they rubbed the cornstalk bows with resins, and the 3 sat there scraping of their joy. It was now fine music the frogs and the boys did in the towering Illinois twilight make, and into dark, in spite of a shoulder's ache, a boy's hunched body loved out of a stalk the first song of his happiness, and the song woke his heart to the darkness and into the sadness of joy. You will note that the last word of the last line of each of the 3 6-line stanzas is joy. You'd have to be able to look at the poem, I suppose, to pick that out very easily. Then he ends the poem with the phrase, into the sadness of joy. What does that mean? You decide, and let me know what you think, if you'd like to do so. Into the sadness of joy. Complicated. Now, then, here's another poem by Richard Wilbur, and here it is, if I can find it. It's called Hamlin Brook. Hamlin Brook. Bookmarks. I have to do that because I'm reading directly from the books instead of from prepared texts. But here it is. I found it at last. Hamlin Brook by Richard Wilbur. Now pay attention to some of the aspects of this poem, if you can make them out. At the alder-darkened brink where the stream slows to a lucid jet, I lean to the water, dinting its top with sweat, and see, before I can drink, a startled inchling trout of spotted near transparency, trawling a shadow solider than he. He swerves now, darting out to where, in a flicked slough of sparks and glittering silt, he weaves through stream-bed rocks, disturbing foundered leaves, and butts them out of view. Beneath a sliding glass, crazed by the skimming of a brace of burnished dragonflies across its face, in which deep cloudlets pass, and a white precipice of mirrored birch trees plunges down toward where the azures of the zenith drown. How shall I drink all this? Joy's trick is to supply dry lips with what can cool and slake, leaving them dumbstruck also with an ache nothing can satisfy. Well, I think you have to probably read that a couple of times to understand the whole thing, but this is structurally a complex poem with 4-line stanzas. Let me show it to you here. 4-line stanzas of varying length, but with a rhyme scheme in which the first and last lines, 1 and 4, rhyme, as do the 2 middle lines of each stanza. Let me go through some of this again. At the alder darkened brink, where the stream slows to a lucid jet, I lean to the water, dinting its top with sweat, and see, before I can drink, brink, drink, jet, sweat. And the rhymes are subtle enough so that they don't sound sing-songy at all. A startled inchling trout of spotted near transparency, trawling a shadow solider than he. He swerves now, darting out. Trout out, transparency he. Transparency and he is really not a complete rhyme. It's what we call a para-rhyme, but it works. So that's Hamlin Brook. The joy here is in the totality of this finely carved poem. This poem is absolutely wonderful in its structure and form. And Richard Wilbur, of course, is one of the leading modern poets. And he's one of the few people who would be up to that kind of thing. Okay, now let's go on and get rid of a bookmark. And then we're going to find a poem by Sylvia Plath called Your, You Are, or as she has the title, You apostrophe R-E, You Are. And think of her looking at or holding her baby. Clown-like, happiest on your hands, feet to the stars and moon scold, gilled like a fish, a common sense thumbs down on the dodo's mode, wrapped up in yourself like a spool, trawling your dark as owls do, mute as a turnip from the 4th of July to All Fool's Day. Oh, high riser, my little loaf, vague as fog and looked for like mail, farther off than Australia, bent-backed Atlas, our traveled prawn, snug as a bud, and at home like a sprat in a pickle jug, a creel of eels, all ripples, jumpy as a Mexican bean, right like a well-done sum, a clean slate with your own face on. Yeah, you are. And, of course, the title and the first line of the poem go together. You are clone-like. You see how that works. You are clone-like, happiest on your hands, feet to the stars, and moon scold, gilled like a fish, a common sense thumbs down on the dodo's mode. Well, that's a little complicated, but it's really just a series of words to describe a happy child in her arms, wrapped up in yourself like a spool, traveling your dark as owls do, and so on. It's a wonderful little poem by Sylvia Plath. This is a poem in which the word joy is not expressly written, but it is a happy poem. It's a happy poem by a mother who's being made happy by her child, her small child in her arms. And it is one of her babies. The father of the baby was the poet Ted Hughes. And at the time she wrote this poem, she and Ted were not on good terms. It is hard to believe that later on, not too much later, Sylvia Plath killed herself. Yeah, killed herself with the city gas put out by London at that time. And it was in the 1920s a favorite form of suicide for women who were so inclined in England. I hope that some of you will be intrigued enough by these poems to find this book. It's called Joy, as edited by Christian Wyman. It's probably can be found at the library, wherever you are. And after all, there are 96 more poems to read in it. So get after it. Hope you will tune in next week. And thanks for being with us today.